Can you believe it? Imagine a kingdom, ancient and proud, brought to its knees, not by a foreign invasion or a massive army, but by a simple, terrifying legal loophole. A catastrophe no one saw coming. An earthquake that didn't just rattle the foundations of Scotland, but utterly pulverized them into dust, wiping away 400 years of freedom in a single fatal stroke. This isn't just history. This is the story of how a single ruthless man, King Edward I of England, managed to steal an entire nation, and the desperate, bloody price paid by the heroes who fought to take it back. This is the beginning of the Wars of Scottish Independence, a saga so brutal, so filled with betrayal and impossible comebacks that it defies belief. We are talking about an era where the concept of loyalty was a myth, where kings were mere puppets, and where the only law recognized was the swing of the executioner's axe. The year is 1286, and the stage is set for the greatest political thriller the medieval world ever witnessed. For generations, Scotland had maintained a fragile but real independence, held together by the strong, if sometimes controversial, line of the House of Dunkeld. King Alexander III, a man known for bringing stability and even prosperity, seemed invincible. He was Scotland's anchor, the reason the Northern Kingdom could stand firm against the growing, hungry power of its southern neighbor, England, the behemoth everyone feared. But fate, that cruel mistress, decided to rewrite the script on a dark night in 1286. Alexander III was riding at a breakneck pace to meet his young queen across the Firth of Forth. It was a storm-tossed evening, the path was treacherous, and in a terrifying flash, the king was thrown from his horse and perished instantly, his neck snapped by the brutal impact. The anchor was gone. Silence, absolute, terrifying silence descended upon the land as the news spread like wildfire. Scotland had lost its king, and worse, his direct heirs were already gone. The only remaining claimant was a tiny, fragile 3-year-old girl living across the sea in Norway, Margaret, the Maid of Norway. This wasn't just a political crisis, it was a biological extinction event for the royal line, leaving a vacuum so vast it threatened to suck the whole nation into oblivion. The powerful Scottish nobility, the guardians of Scotland, knew they were sailing straight into a Category 5 hurricane. They desperately tried to manage the interregnum, praying that the Maid of Norway would arrive safely to assume her crown. But they had a monstrous, terrifying problem looming directly south. Edward I of England, known already by the chilling nickname Longshanks. Edward was not just a powerful king. He was a brilliant lawyer, a manipulative politician, and an absolute master of exploiting weakness. He saw this power vacuum, this 3-year-old girl on a distant ship, not as a tragedy for his cousin's kingdom, but as the perfect, God-given opportunity to finally complete his lifelong ambition, the total, permanent subjugation of the entire British Isles under the iron fist of the English crown. His gaze turned north, and he began to move. The Scottish guardians were trapped, and they knew it. The realm was already fractious, plagued by rival noble families, most notably the ambitious Bruces and the powerful Balliols, who were ready to tear the kingdom apart, fighting over who had the best ancestral claim to the throne. If they tried to solve this internally, civil war was guaranteed, and Edward would simply march north and take everything while they were distracted by their own internal squabbles. So, in a move that historians still debate as either an act of genius necessity or fatal, unforgivable cowardice, they did the unthinkable, the action that would curse Scotland for a century. They invited Edward I, the most ruthlessly ambitious king in Europe, to step in and act as the arbiter in the succession dispute known as the Great Cause. They asked the wolf to guard the sheepfold, believing his legal prowess would bring order. Edward played the role of the impartial judge perfectly, at first, but his demands were instantly chilling. The fine print of the contract was soaked in poison. Before he would even consider hearing the claims of the 13 potential candidates vying for the Scottish crown, he insisted on one minor, yet civilization-ending detail. He demanded that every Scottish noble, every spiritual leader, and every major landowner formally recognize him, Edward I, as the undisputed Lord Paramount of Scotland. This was the poison pill that destroyed their future. This wasn't just mediation. This was the silent, legal seizure of sovereignty, the moment they acknowledged that their ancient kingdom was merely a feudal dependency of England. The very moment they signed that parchment, they surrendered 400 years of freedom for the fleeting, desperate hope of stability. And yet, one by one, desperate and terrified of immediate anarchy, they signed. They bowed. They placed the noose around their own neck. Then came the second tragedy, a twist of fate so cruel it felt scripted by the devil himself. Young Margaret, the Maid of Norway, the last true hope of the House of Dunkeld, never made it to Scotland. Her ship, battered by the North Sea, landed in the remote Orkney Islands. And there, the 3-year-old queen succumbed to illness. She died, leaving the throne utterly, completely vacant. The interregnum was over, and the crisis had become terminal, absolute. Edward I, now legally recognized as the Lord Paramount, moved swiftly to cement his total control over the Great Cause. He engineered a massive, biased legal tribunal, not to find the best candidate, but to find the most compliant one, the man who would obey his every whim. He manipulated the proceedings until one man, John Balliol, ascended the throne. Balliol had a decent hereditary claim, but more importantly, Edward knew he was weak, malleable, and utterly dependent on English power to maintain his position. The coronation of John Balliol in 1292 should have ended the crisis, but it merely started the clock on a ticking time bomb. Scotland now had a king, but he was Edward's king, a puppet warming the seat until Longshanks decided to take it for himself. Edward immediately began humiliating his new vassal relentlessly. He forced Balliol to constantly travel south to answer frivolous legal appeals in English courts, treating him like a minor earl rather than a sovereign monarch. He demanded that Scottish troops be raised to fight Edward's wars in France, a blatant violation of any remaining dignity Scotland possessed. He was deliberately grinding Scotland's face into the dirt. The Scottish nobility, already simmering with white-hot resentment over their signed oaths, watched their king being systematically stripped of all respect and power, day after agonizing day. They had traded a potential civil war, understood that Edward had not come to mediate. He had come to conquer, slowly and legally. And when John Balliol finally pushed past his breaking point, dared to sign a defensive treaty with France, Scotland's ancient ally, Edward I saw his long-awaited casus belli, his justification for total war. This was the moment he had planned for years. The hammer of the Scots lifted his weapon, and in 1296 the English army smashed across the border, sacking Berwick and signaling the start of a conflict that would define the next century. The age of kings was over. The age of blood had just begun, and the world was about to meet William Wallace.
The horror of Berwick was not an anomaly. It was a blueprint. Edward Longshanks did not just want to conquer Scotland. He wanted to erase it. After the bloodbath at the border town, the English army, swollen with victory and arrogance, marched deeper into the heartland, finding little organized resistance. King John Balliol, the puppet king, whose strings had been so carefully cut by Edward himself, was utterly broken.
The man they called Tomb Tabard, Empty Coat, was forced into the deepest humiliation imaginable. In a solemn, agonizing ceremony, Balliol was stripped of his royal insignia, his crown, his robes, and his very title, reducing a sovereign monarch to a pathetic footnote in history. Edward then exiled Balliol to the Tower of London, effectively dissolving the Scottish monarchy and declaring himself the sole rightful overlord of the entire island of Great Britain. But Edward's appetite for symbolic destruction didn't stop there. He knew that to truly kill a nation's spirit, you must steal its soul, its history, its myths. His prized targets were the sacred relics of Scottish nationhood, the physical embodiment of 1,000 years of independence and self-rule. The first great theft was the Black Rood, the holy relic allegedly containing a fragment of the true cross, cherished by the Scots for centuries. Next, and far more devastating, was the capture of the Stone of Scone. This was not just a rock. It was the ancient coronation stone upon which every Scottish king, from the mythological origins to the present day, had been invested with divine right and power. Edward dragged this sacred symbol out of Scone Abbey, hauling it south to Westminster Abbey, where he planned to build a special, imposing throne to enclose it. mocking Scottish sovereignty forever. He was essentially telling Scotland, "Your history is mine, your future is mine, and your kings will only ever rule by my permission, or not at all." The psychological warfare was as effective as the sword. Edward then installed a vast network of English administrators, collected ruinous, punitive taxes, and demanded an oath of fealty from every nobleman, every bishop, and every freeman in the land. The Ragman Rolls, a massive document listing every Scot who submitted, became the definitive ledger of national submission, a mark of shame burned into the national psyche. Scotland was, for all intents and purposes, dead. It was merely a northern province of the vast Angevin Empire, awaiting total assimilation. But while the great nobles shamefully bowed and signed their names in submission, something dangerous was brewing in the dark corners of the countryside. The English occupation was brutal, arrogant, and rapacious. English law replaced Scottish tradition, and the soldiers treated the populace not as subjects, but as conquered property ripe for plunder, often resorting to violence and murder to enforce their sudden foreign dominance. It was into this furnace of oppression that a man of common gentry, a man without land, title, or powerful friends, emerged. William Wallace. Wallace was not part of the established noble system. He was a nobody, a younger son with nothing to inherit, and therefore nothing to lose. Unlike the high-born lords who were already counting the cost of resistance, Wallace had nothing but his fierce patriotism and an unshakable belief that Scotland deserved to be free, no matter the price. His first acts were not grand military campaigns, but sudden, blinding flashes of pure, uncontrolled vengeance. The history books record his rage exploding in the town of Lanark, triggered by the murder of his wife, Marion Braidfoot, at the hands of the local English sheriff, the cruel Sir William Heselrigg. The official English narrative quickly labeled Wallace a mere outlaw, a criminal who killed Heselrigg purely for personal vendetta and banditry. But the truth was that the murder of Marion Braidfoot, or perhaps the brutal execution leading to it, became the ultimate defining catalyst for his life. In a scene of raw, terrifying violence, Wallace and a small band of intensely loyal men descended on Lanark under the cover of night. They found Heselrigg, dragged him into the streets, and executed him with extreme prejudice, tearing down the very symbols of English authority. This was not a subtle assassination. It was a public declaration of war against the entire occupying force, a message written in the sheriff's own blood and guts, intended for the English garrisons far and wide. Wallace immediately became the most wanted man in Scotland, hunted by every English soldier from the Solway to the Clyde. But to the desperate, disenfranchised peasants and lesser gentry, he became something far more potent, a symbol of impossible, righteous hope. The legend of the massive, fearsome warrior who wielded a claymore larger than most men began to spread like wildfire through the glens and villages, offering a tangible alternative to submission. While Wallace was busy igniting the common people, the legitimate Scottish nobility, the Bruces, the Commons, the Stuarts, were engaged in their own bitter, self-serving squabbles and diplomatic games. They had briefly attempted a formal rising in 1297, known cynically as the Rising of the Nobles. But this attempt was fatally flawed and pathetic. The nobles distrusted each other more than they hated Edward, and their armies were poorly coordinated and quickly melted away when confronted by disciplined English forces. At Irvine, they surrendered almost without a fight, proving that national liberation would not come from the pampered hands of the high-born elite who feared losing their land more than their liberty. This failure cemented Wallace's unique outsider position. The cause of freedom had been abandoned by its supposed guardians, leaving the field open for a genuine underdog fueled by popular support. Wallace's forces grew exponentially, swelling with hardened farmers, minor knights, and men whose only desire was to drive the foreign occupiers out of their homes, not to gain titles or land. In the north, another crucial figure was rising: Andrew Murray, a powerful young magnate leading a parallel, successful guerrilla campaign in the rugged terrain of Murray and Inverness. Murray was noble-born, disciplined, and strategic, capturing castles and organizing large-scale resistance, while Wallace operated in the south. Wallace recognized the power of unified action. The two forces, the peasant champion and the northern lord, began to coordinate their efforts, merging their scattered rebellion into a single, terrifying movement, mobilizing toward a strategic point on the River Forth. They were no longer scattered rebels. They were a coordinated army, poised to challenge the English might at the crossing that guarded the heart of Scotland. The English commanders, comfortable in their heavily fortified castles and arrogant with their recent victories, saw the names Wallace and Murray as nothing more than bandit leaders, a fatal miscalculation that would soon cost them their entire force. They were about to learn that sometimes the greatest armies are not those defined by pedigree, but those fueled by pure, unalterated national rage. The Scottish elite, those silk-clad, land-rich cowards who should have been the first line of defense, had failed the moment the dust settled at Dunbar. They had lined up like pathetic, broken dolls to sign the infamous Ragman rolls, swearing fealty to the man they called the Hammer of the Scots, the cold, calculating Edward I. But while the lords bowed and scraped, surrendering their dignity for the preservation of their estates, a different kind of storm was brewing in the dark, unforgiving glens and forests, a storm fueled not by political maneuvering, but by personal, visceral blood debt. This was the moment history introduced William Wallace, a name whispered first in fear by the English occupation forces, and later roared as a battle cry by a nation refusing to die. Wallace was not a titled earl or a storied duke. He was a man of middling birth, perhaps a minor landowner, but fundamentally he was an outlaw, hardened by immediate, unforgiving injustice. His story was not about crown rights or ancient treaties. It was about pure, unadulterated vengeance for the murder of his love, Marion Braidfoot, by the English Sheriff of Lanark, a man named William Heselrigg. When Wallace struck, he did not send envoys or issue declarations. He stormed Lanark, a terrifying phantom emerging from the shadows, and executed Heselrigg with a brutality that sent seismic shivers through every English garrison in the lowlands. This act was not merely resistance, it was a declaration of war stamped in the blood of an. Suddenly, every farmer, every blacksmith, every man who had felt the weight of the English boot on his neck, saw in Wallace the embodiment of their silent, burning rage. They rallied to him, a militia defined not by polished armor, but by the sheer, desperate necessity of freedom, arming themselves with whatever crude weapon they could forge or find. Meanwhile, miles to the north, a crucial parallel resistance was igniting under the leadership of Andrew Moray, a young nobleman who had refused to be humiliated into submission. Moray, unlike Wallace, possessed the aristocratic connection and the tactical acumen honed in the higher echelons of warfare, but he shared the same ferocious commitment to independence. The union of these two forces, the commoner genius and the noble rebel, created an axis of terror that Edward I had tragically underestimated. They swept across the northern shires, systematically purging English strongholds, laying siege to castles, and forcing the shattered remnants of the occupation forces to retreat into the perceived safety of the south. Edward, occupied with his endless, costly war machine in France, dismissed these actions as mere banditry, a petty distraction that could be swiftly crushed by his lieutenants. The job of annihilation fell to John de Warrenay, the Earl of Surrey, a man whose military pedigree was matched only by his profound, aristocratic arrogance, and Hugh de Cressingham, the notoriously greedy and deeply detested royal treasurer. Cressingham was not just there to fight. He was there to ensure the campaign was fast and cheap, desperate to return to the profitable business of extorting taxes from the conquered populace. They amassed a colossal army, a glittering, terrifying host of heavily armored knights, archers, and professional infantry, believing this would be nothing more than a punitive walkover. In September 1297, this magnificent, arrogant English force marched toward Stirling, the strategic heart of Scotland, where Wallace and Moray waited. The two Scottish commanders were not fools. They understood that meeting the full force of English heavy cavalry on open ground was suicidal. They chose their ground with surgical precision, the River Forth, spanned by the old Stirling Bridge. This bridge was not a grand multi-lane structure. It was a narrow, terrifying wooden choke point, barely wide enough to accommodate two horsemen riding abreast, an engineering flaw that Wallace intended to weaponize into an executioner's tool. Surrey and Cressingham, looking down from the comfort of their command positions, saw the ragged Scottish schiltrons, the dense, terrifying hedgehogs of spears, waiting on the north bank, and felt only contempt. They spent 2 days arguing, agonizing over the logistics, receiving warnings from local Scots who desperately tried to explain the lethal risk of the crossing. But arrogance, that terminal affliction of empire, won the day. On the morning of September 11th, the English began their fatal march. They poured onto the narrow wooden planks, thousands upon thousands of men and horses compressed into a single, vulnerable line, a river of steel flowing into a canyon of doom. Wallace and Moray waited with the patience of predators. They allowed the head of the column, the vanguard of the most elite English soldiers, to cross the river, committing them fully to the north bank, while the bulk of Surrey's force remained frustratingly jammed on the south side. The moment the tactical equilibrium shifted, the moment the gap between the two halves of the English army became a fatal breach, Wallace gave the signal. The Scottish spearmen surged forward, a tidal wave of fury crashing down onto the confused, bottlenecked enemy. The small force that had crossed found themselves trapped, unable to maneuver their heavy cavalry, their formation dissolving into chaos and panic. It was not a battle. It was an industrial slaughterhouse. The narrowness of the bridge, which had been meant to facilitate the English crossing, now served as an insurmountable barrier, preventing reinforcements from reaching the dying. English soldiers, crushed by the press of their own ranks, or pushed into the swift cold waters of the Forth, drowned beneath the weight of their own armor. John de Warenne, the great Earl of Surrey, watched the absolute destruction of his vanguard from the relative safety of the south bank, and, in a moment of utter professional shame, ordered the bridge destroyed and fled the field, abandoning thousands of his men to their fate. Hugh de Cressingham, the hated treasurer whose greed had hurried the campaign, died fighting, and his end was perhaps the most brutally symbolic moment of the day. The enraged Scots, recognizing the face of the extortionist, flayed his body, taking pieces of his skin as macabre, powerful trophies to celebrate the fact that they had not just won a battle, but had inflicted a wound so deep it would echo through the decades. Stirling Bridge was not merely a victory, it was the birth certificate of Scottish defiance, instantly elevating William Wallace from outlaw to the undisputed guardian of the realm, a title he would wear with the weight of an entire nation on his shoulders. The blood on the ramparts of Stirling was still slick, but William Wallace knew that victory was merely the violent prologue to an infinitely darker, more demanding chapter of war. He was no longer just a rebel. He was the political and military master of Scotland, a position that demanded immediate, audacious action to solidify the impossible gains won against the colossal power of England. His next move was calculated, not just to punish the defeated enemy, but to utterly shatter the myth of English invincibility that had shackled Scotland for 2 long, agonizing years. He was taking the war directly to the source of the evil, Edward's own borders. This was the infamous Great Raid, an invasion of unprecedented scale, where Scottish forces poured across the Tweed, burning, looting, and terrorizing the northern counties of England from border to border, leaving nothing but ruin in their wake. reminding every English lord that Scotland was free and dangerously aggressive. Wallace was demonstrating that the fight for independence was not just defensive, it was existential, forcing Edward to deal with a crisis on his own soil. This audacious move served its immediate purpose, proving to the world that the Scottish resistance was real, but it simultaneously guaranteed Edward I's total, furious commitment to their destruction. When news of the Scottish firestorm reached the aging English monarch, who was currently bogged down in diplomatic squabbles in Flanders, the sheer rage that seized the king was said to have shaken the very foundations of his temporary residence. He had been humiliated, his carefully constructed dominance reduced to ash by a commoner. Edward, already known for his explosive temper and terrifyingly focused military resolve, cut short his European affairs immediately. The game was over. Diplomacy and proxies had failed spectacularly. Now, the hammer of the Scots himself would deliver the vengeance. He gathered an army so vast, so overwhelming, that chroniclers struggled to find parallels in recent history. This was not a punitive expedition. This was the total annihilation of a nation and its defiant champion, designed to silence Scotland forever. The feudal levies of England, the disciplined infantry of Wales, and even mercenary forces from Ireland were summoned under the royal banner, creating a military machine designed to crush resistance utterly and permanently. The sheer scale of the preparation sent shivers through Europe. Edward was returning to Scotland, not as an arbiter, but as the executioner, commanding perhaps the largest force ever assembled by an English king up to that time, an army that dwarfed Wallace's forces exponentially. Wallace, keenly aware of the tidal wave brewing south, knew he could not meet Edward head-on in an open field. The resources were simply too disparate. The sheer cavalry numbers of the English force would swallow his infantry whole, turning his victory into a distant memory. His strategy became one of brutal attrition, scorched earth. Every field was burned, every source of supply destroyed, every defensible town evacuated, transforming the Scottish lowlands into a deadly, empty wasteland. Designed to starve the massive English army into submission long before they reached his core forces. This was a desperate gamble, requiring unimaginable sacrifice from the very people he was trying to save, turning their homes into defensive liabilities, forcing them to become complicit in the destruction of their own land. The logistics of feeding Edward's 25,000-plus men became a nightmare that Wallace hoped would force a retreat, or, at the very least, split the invading force due to internal dissent. For weeks, the strategy worked perfectly. The English army was starving, morale was plummeting, and Edward was on the very verge of ordering a humiliating, disastrous withdrawal, unable to sustain his vast host in the barren landscape. The famine was doing more damage than any Scottish sword could achieve.
But history has a cruel sense of irony, and the location of Wallace's main force was betrayed by the very people he fought to liberate. Two Scottish lords, driven either by old jealousies or simple, paralyzing fear of Edward's wrath, delivered the exact coordinates of Wallace's army near the town of Falkirk.
The news was a godsend to the starving English king, a sudden, unexpected reprieve from total logistical failure. On July 22, 1298, the two armies met in what would become the bloodiest, most tragic day of William Wallace's legendary career.
The Scots formed their famous schiltrons, massive, impenetrable circles of tightly packed spearmen, a human hedgehog bristling with lethal points, designed to break the charge of the most formidable heavy cavalry in the world.
The opening English cavalry charge was indeed devastatingly repelled, the knights crashing against the spear walls only to be impaled and thrown back, just as they had been at Stirling Bridge. But Edward had learned the terrifying lesson of the bridge. He knew how to break the infantry's discipline without engaging them hand to hand. He had brought a hidden weapon, a technological terror that Wallace had no counter for, the legendary Welsh longbowmen. These archers, operating at a terrifying distance, delivered thousands of heavy, armor-piercing arrows into the static, unprotected ranks of the schiltrons. It was a massacre from afar, a brutal, relentless rain of death that tore gaping holes in the Scottish formations, shattering the discipline that was their only defense, forcing men to break ranks and expose themselves. Once the schiltrons were sufficiently weakened and disorganized by the relentless barrage, Edward unleashed his heavy cavalry once more. They smashed into the already broken infantry, turning the field into a grinding, indiscriminate slaughterhouse. Thousands of Scots died that day. The backbone of Wallace's national army was utterly broken. His victory at Stirling avenged in full measure by the sheer, overwhelming military power and strategic cunning of the English crown. Falkirk was not just a defeat, it was a devastating indictment of relying solely on infantry against a superior combined arms force. The political fallout was immediate and catastrophic, confirming the fears of the skeptical Scottish nobility. Blamed for the catastrophic loss and unable to maintain the consensus required to govern a fractured nation, William Wallace performed the most tragic, noble act of his career. He resigned the title of Guardian of Scotland. He passed the poisoned chalice to two reluctant successors, Robert the Bruce, the young, ambitious Earl of Carrick, and John Cummin, Bruce's great rival. The internal political divisions immediately rekindled. The unity Wallace had forged dissolved in the face of crushing defeat. Wallace became an outlaw once more, slipping into the shadows, a ghost seeking foreign aid. He traveled across Europe, to France, even perhaps Rome, trying desperately to rally support for his lost cause, becoming an international fugitive for liberty. But the hammer of the Scots had struck hard, and for a short, terrible time, it seemed Wallace's fire had been extinguished forever. The fight for independence was now left to the fractured, squabbling nobility, paving the way for the true, complex contender to step into the blood-soaked spotlight and claim the destiny that Wallace could not secure. The embers of resistance, smothered by the brutal efficiency of the English machine following Wallace's gruesome end, still glowed in the darkest corners of the North. The common folk wept, but the true battle was now being fought not on the fields of Stirling or Falkirk, but in the murky, blood-splattered halls of political ambition. For years, Robert the Bruce, the young Earl of Carrick, had played the ultimate dangerous double game, swearing fealty to Edward I one moment, whispering treason in Gaelic the next, always calculating, always waiting for the perfect tectonic shift in power. He was no simple peasant champion. He was the scion of a powerful line, a man who saw the crown not as a destiny bestowed by God, but as a prize to be seized by ruthless intellect and cold steel. The stage was set for the defining, horrific act that would tear Scotland's aristocracy in two and light the fuse for the final, deadly revolution. The greatest obstacle wasn't the English king. It was John Comyn, the Red Comyn, the other powerful claimant to the empty throne, and a man who represented the deep historical rivalry that kept Scotland paralyzed and weak, forever vulnerable to the predatory gaze of the South. The political stakes were astronomical, and only one of them could survive the coming storm of treason. The air in Greyfriars Church, Dumfries, on that cold February morning in 1306, was thick with unspoken threats and the weight of a shattered kingdom. This was not a meeting of reconciliation. It was the final, fatal reckoning between the two most powerful men in Scotland. Bruce confronted Comyn, accusing him of treacherous communication with Edward, of selling out the nation for scraps of English favor, and perpetuating the cycle of dependence. The argument escalated past the point of no return. Within the consecrated walls, before the very altar of God, Bruce drew his dagger, a move so reckless, so sacrilegious, that it could only be born of absolute, desperate necessity to achieve the unity required for survival. He plunged the blade into Comyn, collapsing the rival claimant in a shocking pool of aristocratic blood, sealing his own damnation in the process. Rushing back outside, breathless and horrified by his own sacrilege, Bruce reportedly cried, "I doubt I have slain the Comyn," to which his quick-witted, ruthless supporter, Roger D. Kirkpatrick, responded with chilling finality, "You doubt? I'll make sure." He and the others stormed back inside to finish the dreadful work, ensuring John Comyn was unequivocally dead, thus eliminating the last major internal threat to Bruce's claim. With the blood of Comyn staining his soul, Robert the Bruce had crossed the Rubicon. He was instantly excommunicated by the Pope for the horrific act of murder in a holy place, a spiritual curse
that would haunt his entire reign and provide ammunition for every enemy. But he was now, undeniably, the undisputed leader of the patriotic cause, having forcibly removed the final challenger. He moved with lightning speed, capitalizing on the shockwave his actions had created. Just weeks later, on March 25th, 1306, Bruce was formally crowned King of Scots at Scone, the ancient site where Scottish monarchs had been legitimized for centuries.
This was not a glorious ceremony, adorned with jewels and pomp. It was a desperate scramble, a declaration of total war against the most powerful empire in Europe, performed under the watchful, hostile eyes of Edward I's vast network of spies. Edward I, already enraged by the endless rebellion, declared Bruce a sworn traitor and vowed a vengeance so complete that the very name of Scotland would be erased from the map, sending immediate punitive forces north. The initial response from the English hammer was swift and devastating, proving the sheer power of the colossal English military machine. Bruce, attempting to establish his reign militarily, suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Methven just 3 months after his coronation, a brutal lesson in the realities of open warfare against professional armies. Methven was not merely a defeat. It was a total annihilation of his early forces, scattering his support base and leaving his new claim utterly invalid in the eyes of the world. Bruce became a hunted outlaw, a king without a kingdom, forced to flee into the wild, desolate reaches of the Scottish Highlands, often relying on the kindness of shepherds and the cover of perpetual mist. His enemies, led by the merciless English commanders, hunted him like a rabid dog, offering huge bounties for his capture and ensuring no safe harbor existed. His wife, his daughter, and many of his most loyal supporters were seized. The women, including Queen Elizabeth and Bruce's sister Mary, were subjected to horrific public humiliation, placed in cages or imprisoned in castles, while many of his brothers and close allies were executed with the same terrifying brutality that had claimed Wallace, confirming the fate of all who defied the English crown. Bruce was utterly alone, forced to survive on meager rations, facing starvation, freezing temperatures, and constant betrayal from those seeking the rich English reward. This was the dark crucible where the legend of Robert the Bruce was truly forged, not as a powerful noble, but as a desperate, relentless survivor, learning the unforgiving nature of the land and the necessity of unconventional tactics. The famous legend of the spider, often dismissed as mere folklore, captures the spirit of this agonizing period. Watching a spider repeatedly fail to spin its web, only to succeed on the 7th attempt, provided the hunted king with the ultimate lesson in perseverance. That failure was merely a delayed victory, and giving up was the only true. As Bruce endured the crushing hardship of his exile, hiding on the island of Rathlin, a dramatic divine intervention, or perhaps just historical luck, occurred. The hammer of the Scots was finally silenced. Edward I, relentlessly marching north one last time to extinguish the Bruce threat forever, succumbed to dysentery in July 1307,
just short of the Scottish border, his final venomous breath failing to reach his intended victim. The psychological impact of his death was instantaneous and immeasurable. The Titan, the fearsome architect of Scotland's misery, was gone, replaced by a vacuum of military leadership. Edward II, his son and successor, inherited the crown and the war, but possessed none of his father's strategic genius, iron will, or terrifying focus, quickly proving himself more interested in courtly pursuits than brutal conquest. This single event was the seismic shift Bruce had waited for. The moment the old tyrant fell, Bruce sprang into action. He returned to the mainland, launching a brutal, highly effective guerrilla war campaign in Ayrshire, utilizing the knowledge and terrain he gained while in hiding.
This was not the warfare of armored knights meeting in open battle. This was the methodical dismantling of the English occupation through hit-and-run attacks, ambushes in the misty glens, and the slow, calculated destruction of every English garrison and Scottish noble who still supported the foreign regime, signaling the start of the 8-year campaign that would lead to the decisive moment of truth.
Edward I, the Hammer, was finally dust. Dragged beneath the unforgiving Scottish soil he had tried so desperately to conquer. But his death did not bring peace. It only unleashed a successor who proved strategically incapable of holding the brutal ground his father had paid for in blood and gold. Robert the Bruce was no longer just a fugitive bandit. He was now the King of Shadows, utilizing the vast, unforgiving wilderness of Scotland as his ultimate weapon against the lumbering might of the English war machine. The English expected a confrontation, a grand, glorious field battle, where their heavy cavalry and superior numbers could smash the rebellion into oblivion. But Bruce denied them that satisfaction at every single turn, choosing instead the terrifying, invisible dance of the guerrilla warrior. His scorched earth policy was ruthless, a desperate measure of a man determined to win or watch his entire nation burn. No food, no shelter, no resource was to be left for the invaders.
This was war, fought not with polished shields and trumpets, but with terror and hunger, turning every mile of occupied territory into a trap, a death sentence for any foraging party daring to stray from the safety of the main column, always wondering if the next farmhouse contained supplies or a hidden ambush. The first sign that this new, leaner Scottish force was not the broken rabble of old came in 1307 at Loudon Hill, a masterclass in exploiting terrain against overwhelming power that would be taught in military academies for centuries to come, proving Bruce had learned the bitter lessons of previous defeats. Bruce, recovering from a debilitating illness that had nearly claimed his life, knew he could not meet the English cavalry led by the Earl of Pembroke head-on, for that would be suicide, a rerun of Falkirk's horrific slaughter that had nearly cost Wallace everything. Instead, he chose a narrow causeway through thick, sucking marshland, a watery, unstable choke point that stripped the mighty English war horses of their terrifying speed and momentum, rendering them little more than confused, heavy targets, trapped in the mud and mire.
With calculated precision, his men dug deep ditches, concealed by brush and grass, funneling the proud, charging English column directly into a killing zone, where their armor became a deadly anchor, dragging them down into the bog and the awaiting spears. The Scottish schiltrons, smaller but faster and unburdened, struck the trapped vanguard with a ferocity that stunned the invaders, shattering the myth of English invincibility in a single, desperate afternoon of chaos and mud. Pembroke was routed, his army decimated, and the signal was sent ringing across the ravaged land. The King of Shadows was not only alive, but he was learning how to hunt the hunter with lethal efficiency, turning their greatest strength into their fatal weakness. Now began the campaign of calculated annihilation, an 8-year siege of attrition, where the primary target was not men, but stone, brick, and the very idea of English permanence on Scottish soil. Bruce understood that any English-held castle was a cancer, a permanent supply hub and a symbol of authority that needed to be surgically removed. But he refused to garrison them, knowing he lacked the manpower to hold permanent strongholds against a counterattack. Instead, the order was simple, chilling, and ruthlessly effective. Dismantle them stone by stone, ripping down the walls, filling the moats, and turning the proud fortresses back into mounds of rubble and dust, making them utterly useless to any returning English force that might need shelter or defense. This was the infamous Slightning Campaign, a relentless march that saw key strongholds like Rutherglen, Ayr, and eventually Dumfries reduced to ruins, destroying not just structures, but the logistical spine of the entire English occupation, proving that Bruce's genius lay in strategy as much as combat. It was a monumental, back-breaking effort, often undertaken by the same men who had fought the battles, turning soldiers into demolitions experts, proving that the struggle for independence was fought with pickaxes and gunpowder, just as much as with swords and spears, stripping the invader of every safe haven. The English garrisons, isolated, under constant siege, and utterly terrified by the speed and brutality of these midnight attacks, began to starve, their morale collapsing as they realized that even the thickest walls could not save them from the king who refused to play by the established rules of conventional medieval warfare. Meanwhile, across the border, the utterly distracted and politically weak Edward II was facing the twin disasters of internal baronial revolt and the increasingly humiliating reports pouring in from the north, painting a picture of total loss of control that threatened to unravel his already unstable reign. He attempted a grand, sweeping invasion in 1310, dragging a vast but poorly supplied army into Scotland, believing the sheer spectacle of English might would crush the rebellion through intimidation alone and reassert his father's dominance. But the invasion was doomed before it crossed the border. They found nothing but empty fields, poisoned wells, and ghostly villages. The scorched earth strategy having worked perfectly to starve and frustrate the massive column until it had no choice but to retreat in humiliation and disgrace, having achieved absolutely nothing. This failure was the crucial inflection point. Bruce was now confident enough to step out of the shadows and claim the political stage. In 1309, he held his first parliament at St. Andrews, a profound and audacious move that instantly transformed him in the eyes of the world from a mere rebel leader into a ruling sovereign, administering justice and claiming the ancient authority of the Scottish crown with full ceremony. Letters began to fly to European courts, arguing the legality of his kingship and the brutality of the English occupation, starting the sophisticated diplomatic chess game that complemented the bloody warfare on the ground, seeking international recognition for his newly forged realm. The tide had irrevocably turned. Scotland was not just fighting back, it was organizing, legitimizing, and rapidly consolidating its fragmented power base, preparing for the colossal, inevitable showdown that everyone knew was coming. A single, deciding battle for all the marbles. That final confrontation would center around the single most important English fortress still standing on Scottish soil, the great grey sentinel of Stirling Castle, the gatehouse to the Highlands, which remained firmly in English hands, waiting, silently daring Bruce to try and take it, knowing that its fate would ultimately decide the fate of the entire kingdom of Scotland. The euphoria that had swept across Scone Palace during Robert the Bruce's hasty coronation evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold wave of terror that crashed down from England. King Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, heard the news of Bruce's defiance, not with surprise, but with an earth-shattering, visceral rage. This was not merely rebellion. This was personal betrayal by a man Edward had elevated and trusted. The old king, though increasingly frail and plagued by gout, commanded immediate, overwhelming vengeance, promising a terror campaign that would eclipse the barbarity inflicted upon William Wallace's followers. The English retribution was not merely military, it was judicial, swift, and spectacularly cruel, designed to destroy the very idea of Bruce's lineage ever ruling Scotland. Edward's strategy was simple: crush the head of the serpent before it could even fully raise its neck. Forces were mobilized with terrifying speed under the command of Aymer de Valence, the Earl of Pembroke, a man who understood the cold efficiency required to wipe out a nascent rebellion. Bruce, still riding the high of his anointing, fatally misunderstood the gravity of his position. He was a new king, surrounded by inexperienced zealots, and he still harbored chivalric notions of warfare, believing that honor dictated the terms of engagement. He challenged Valence to a pitched battle near Methven, outside Perth, in June 1306. Valence, however, was playing a far deadlier game, agreeing to the battle, but with no intention of fighting fairly. As dusk settled, and Bruce's small, exhausted army
settled into what they believed was a respectful overnight truce before the morning's engagement. Valence launched a devastating, dishonorable surprise attack. It was not a battle. It was a midnight ambush, a panicked rout in the dim twilight. Bruce's men, caught unarmored and unprepared, were scattered to the winds, their formation dissolving into chaos and desperate flight. The coronation honeymoon was over, violently and instantaneously.
Robert the Bruce, the newly anointed king, narrowly escaped capture, saved only by the ferocious fighting retreat of a few loyal knights. He lost his war horse, his banner, and his entire baggage train. Suddenly, the King of Scots was nothing more than a high-value fugitive, stripped of his dignity and desperately running across his own collapsing kingdom, hunted by an enemy whose hounds never rested. This defeat was absolute, forcing Bruce to shed the golden trappings of monarchy and embrace the desolate anonymity of the outlaw. His wife, Queen Elizabeth, and his daughter, Marjorie, along with the other ladies of the court, were frantically sent north, seeking refuge in the deep highlands, hoping to reach the safety of the Orkney Islands or the west coast. Meanwhile, Edward's men secured Perth and began the sickening work of rooting out and executing every man connected to the scone ceremony. Sir Simon Fraser, a prominent supporter, was captured after Methven and hauled south to London. His fate was a medieval horror show meant to terrify all of Christendom. He was hanged, then cut down while still alive, disemboweled, beheaded, and finally quartered, his head placed on a pike beside the rotting skull of William Wallace. The message was clear. Treason against Edward I resulted in a fate worse than death itself, a complete destruction of the body and soul. The political climate had curdled into pure, unadulterated savagery. The pursuit of the royal family led the English forces to Kildrummy Castle, a vital stronghold where Bruce's younger brother, Nigel de Bruce, a strikingly handsome and courageous young man, was attempting to hold out and protect the fleeing women. Though Nigel fought valiantly against overwhelming odds, the castle eventually fell. Edward I showed zero mercy. Nigel was immediately transported to Berwick, the site of past humiliations, and suffered the full, gruesome public execution of hanging, drawing, and quartering. The loss of Nigel was a crushing blow, cutting deep into Bruce's already shattered morale. But the fate of the royal women was perhaps even more psychologically devastating for the hunted king. Queen Elizabeth, his daughter Marjorie, and the Countess of Buchan, who had performed the sacred ritual of placing the crown on Bruce's head, were captured fleeing near Tain after being betrayed by the Earl of Ross. Edward I, constrained by the customs that forbade the execution of noblewomen, devised a punishment that was a masterful stroke of sadistic humiliation and slow torture. The Countess of Buchan was transported to Berwick and locked inside a specially constructed iron or wooden cage, often described as resembling a giant bird cage, which was then suspended high upon the castle walls, exposed to the freezing North Sea gales and the public gaze. She became a living, screaming exhibit, a brutal, visual metaphor for the fate of Scottish independence, caged and mocked. Queen Elizabeth was imprisoned in less exposed but still degrading circumstances, placed under house arrest in various English manors, constantly moved and watched, her royal title ignored, and her future uncertain. The execution of his brothers, the public caging of his supporter, and the imprisonment of his wife and daughter reduced Robert the Bruce to the absolute lowest point imaginable. He was a king without a kingdom, a husband without a wife, a brother without family. By the deep, cold winter of 1306, Bruce was hiding in the desolate reaches of the Hebrides, or possibly Rathlin Island off the coast of Ireland, accompanied by a small, starving band of loyalists. They were freezing, starving, and hunted. He was politically ruined, religiously excommunicated by the Pope for the murder of Comyn, and physically exhausted. Bruce sat in the damp darkness of a cave, contemplating abandoning the entire catastrophic venture, fleeing to Norway, or joining the Knights Templar in the distant Crusades, believing that God himself had turned against the Scottish cause.
It was in this moment of utter despair, shivering and defeated, that the legendary tale of the persistent spider occurred, often mythologized, but representing the necessary psychological turning point. The spider, failing again and again to spin its web across the cavern's ceiling, finally succeeded on the 7th or 8th attempt. Bruce, witnessing this small, stubborn victory of nature, found the infinitesimal spark of courage required to try just one more time. He realized that retreat was surrender, and surrender meant certain death and the permanent enslavement of his nation. He decided, in that freezing dark cave, that he would return to Scotland, not as a glorious king, but as a guerrilla warrior, prepared to fight a war of shadows until the very last drop of English blood was spilled, or his own heart stopped beating. The phase of open revolt was over. The phase of brutal, desperate survival was about to begin.
The winter of 1306 was not just cold. It was a hungry, biting monster that stalked Robert the Bruce as relentlessly as the English hounds, a freezing, desolate period of absolute terror and failure. He was no longer a king in robes, surrounded by armored knights. He was a desperate outlaw, hiding in caves, tasting the bitter ash of defeat with every single breath he took. His crown was the freezing mist, his palace a wet, moss-covered rock face, and his entire kingdom reduced to the handful of loyal, ragged souls who still followed him through the desolate, unforgiving Western Highlands.
Every shadow was an English patrol, every distant sound the harbinger of betrayal, and every meager meal of raw fish or half-cooked berries was a painful, constant reminder of the feasts he had once commanded and the power he had so foolishly lost. This was the ultimate crucible, the desperate test that separated the true king from the pretender. The man who survived this hell would be forged into something absolutely unbreakable,
a weapon honed by pure, agonizing suffering, and Robert Bruce was learning the hard way how to endure. While Bruce shivered on the run, an emotional and physical wreck, Edward I, the old lion, roared his calculated, terrifying victory from the south, ensuring the price of revolt was paid in the highest possible currency, the blood of the Bruce family itself. The capture of Bruce's closest allies and family was not met with chivalry, but with a calculated, terrifying brutality designed to shatter the fragile Scottish spirit and erase the very name of Bruce from the historical record forever. The hammer was falling, heavy and swift, and the cost of this failed uprising was immediately paid in the most devastating of ways. Nigel de Bruce, Bruce's brave, loyal young brother, was cornered in Kildrummy Castle, fighting until the walls ran red with the blood of his men, before being captured, dragged south in chains, and publicly executed by hanging and then beheading in Berwick, an agonizing spectacle of medieval justice. Edward ensured this horrific display was broadcast across the land. This is what happens when you dare challenge the English crown. A message delivered with the gruesome finality of the executioner's blade. Another brother, Thomas, and Alexander, captured during a desperate supply mission in the West, faced the same horrific fate in Carlisle, their deaths marking a grim, heartbreaking tally of the initial price of revolution, tearing Bruce's immediate family to pieces. But Edward's vengeance was not limited to the swift, sharp sword. It was a psychological warfare campaign aimed directly at the heart and honor of the Bruce lineage, twisting the knife of pain and humiliation for those left alive.
Bruce's wife, Elizabeth de Burgh, his sister Mary, and the young, fiercely patriotic Countess of Buchan, Isabella Macduff, the woman who had so famously crowned him just months before, were subjected to a far more insidious and humiliating punishment, a fate arguably worse than a quick death. They were not killed. They were displayed, imprisoned in conditions meant specifically to break their spirits and serve as living, breathing monuments to Bruce's catastrophic failure and Edward's absolute power.
The Countess of Buchan, Isabella, faced the most shocking cruelty. Placed in a crude wooden cage, a spectacle of shame, which was then suspended from the battlements of Berwick Castle, exposed relentlessly to the brutal elements and the constant jeering of the English crowds. This was a horrifying, unforgettable symbol of Edward's absolute, unyielding power and his willingness to degrade the highest Scottish nobility, demonstrating that no one was safe from his wrath. Elizabeth, the Queen, and Mary, the King's sister, faced years of solitary confinement in various English fortresses, stripped of dignity, their fate utterly dependent on the mercy or total lack thereof of the king who hated their family name above all others, existing in a limbo of fear and isolation. News of these horrors, filtered through desperate messengers and whispered rumors in the dark corners of the caves he inhabited, did not crush Bruce. Instead, it refined him, hardening his resolve like steel hit by the blacksmith's hammer. It instantly transformed his initial political ambition for the Scottish throne into a burning,
visceral, and deeply personal vendetta that drove him far beyond simple kingship and into the realm of legend. He was no longer fighting merely for a title or a crown. He was fighting for vengeance, for brutal, essential survival, and for the chance, however slim, to save the broken remnants of his family from the monstrous cruelty of the Hammer of the Scots. The Scottish mainland had become a functional death trap. Every path was watched. Every potential friendly door carried the risk of immediate execution for the homeowner. And Bruce had to disappear completely, to vanish into the ocean itself, if he was to survive this winter. His only hope lay in the fierce, independent loyalty of the Clan MacRory and the powerful MacDonalds of the Isles, the lords of the unforgiving Western Sea, who acknowledged no foreign king.
Crossing the stormy, treacherous waters in small, unstable curraghs, the desperate journey to Rathlin Island, a desolate outcrop off the coast of Ireland, was less a strategic retreat and more a harrowing baptism by freezing water and sheer terror. He arrived a broken man, emotionally bankrupt, utterly defeated, but crucially, he was still breathing, and the spark of kingship had not been fully extinguished. It was here, in the desolate solitude of a cave, that the legendary tale took root. A story that may be embellished by time, but is eternally powerful and defining for the Bruce mythos. Watching a humble spider relentlessly attempt to spin its vital web, failing 6 long times before finally succeeding on the magnificent 7th attempt, Bruce received the existential lesson he desperately needed to hear.
6 times he had been beaten. 6 times he had failed. At Methven, in his subsequent skirmishes, in his initial flight across the land, and 6 times he had been beaten back by the English Leviathan of the occupation army. But the spider's quiet persistence whispered a truth greater than any political treaty or military strategy. If you fail, try, try, try again. Because absolute persistence defeats absolute power. This was the precise moment the fugitive king stopped mourning his losses and started meticulously planning his impossible, audacious return, transforming his mindset from one of flight to one of focused, aggressive counterattack. Rathlin was not a prison. It was a forge where the king was hammered back into fighting shape, where his strategy was refined in the silent darkness. Bruce spent the entire winter of 1306-1307 studying the brutal sea lanes, rebuilding his shattered strength, and meticulously mapping out the specific savage guerrilla warfare strategy that would define the next decade of Scottish history and change warfare forever. He understood he could never fight a conventional war against Edward's vast resources. He needed to fight a psychological war, a long, grinding war of brutal attrition, where every small, shocking victory chipped away at the massive, arrogant structure of English occupation. The plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. Return to the mainland, specifically his own lands in Carrick, and ignite the sacred fire of rebellion anew, not through grand armies or sieges, but through swift, brutal, demoralizing hit-and-run raids. He was trading the massive, crushing army of traditional medieval warfare for the silent, deadly agility of the shadow, becoming a ghost that the English could never truly corner.
He knew the moment he stepped back onto Scottish soil, the hunt for him would resume with lethal, terrifying intensity, ensuring his life would be measured hour by hour. But winter was fading, and with the first thaw of spring 1307, Bruce knew his time had finally come. He had nothing left to lose but his own life and a kingdom, and the lives of his imprisoned family, waiting to be reclaimed from the abyss of tyranny. The fugitive king was ready to return and become the ghost of Scotland, striking from the deep shadows.